Welcome to session 3 of our Journeying with John as we travel through Lent with the fourth Gospel. And today we pick up the Gospel reading that is set this coming Sunday, Jesus and a Jerusalem Pharisee. I've called it that deliberately because our next session is Jesus and a woman of Samaria. And I obviously under the influence of somebody, think it's quite unfair that he get the name and she doesn't. Actually, as we'll indicate next week, she does in the tradition get a name for next week. But he, this week, the Jerusalem Pharisee, we all know his name. Today, we pick up the sequence that is offered by the lectionary during Lent. And the gospel readings are a series of narratives, long narratives, which tell of a series of encounters that Jesus had. We started our gospel readings in Lent with the encounter between Jesus and the tester, Hasatan, in the wilderness in Matthew's gospel. That's not recorded in John's gospel. But now we move for Lent into this sequence in John's gospel, beginning today in Jerusalem with the encounter with Nicodemus, moving on next week into Samaria, the woman by the well. We're going to jump the week after that right down to chapter 9. But as you can see from this chart, in between, there's a series of encounters that Jesus has. Back in Jerusalem with a lame man, whom he heals in chapter 5. Beside the Sea of Galilee, a large crowd whom he feeds and then has a long discussion with in chapter 6. Back in Jerusalem with Jewish leaders in chapter 7. A little insert into John's gospel, which may or may not, probably wasn't part of the original gospel, at the Mount of Olives with an adulterous woman. And then immediately after that, in Jerusalem with Jewish leaders once again. That's a terrible chapter. There's a lot of really negative stuff going back and forth in that chapter between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. Then in chapter 9, still in Jerusalem, and we'll pick this up in 2 weeks' time, a blind man whom Jesus heals. And there's further discussions with the Jewish leaders, which continues on into chapter 10, where Jesus says, I am the sheep gate and I am the good shepherd. Then in chapter 10, continuing on specifically with the Jewish leaders at another festival. And finally, the one that we will get to in Bethany with Mary and Martha and a crowd of mourners because Lazarus has died. So that's where these stories fit. And as you can see, this is one way of going through the first half of John's gospel. The other way is to look at the signs that Jesus performed, which I gave you. I think you've had the list of that. But this is the series of encounters that Jesus has in John's gospel. And this gospel particularly focuses on this aspect because it gives Jesus the opportunity to say lots of things that are important. So whereas in the synoptic gospels, Jesus is traveling and moving from here to there with this people and that group and this group and in this place and in that place. In John's gospel, it's really just a more gentle movement between the north and the south, and a lot more time in the south in Jerusalem, and intense and focused encounters where Jesus does lots of teaching in John's gospel. So we come to Jesus being approached by a Pharisee at night, and we're going to think about at night.
You have some background to the passage about at night in the Gospel of John, because this chapter picks up one of the really important themes in John. And there's a lot of language in John about night, day, and also light and darkness. And it becomes quite significant in this chapter and also the next chapter. In the prologue, we have the author saying those who do evil hate the light, they don't come into it. And it talks about that the light came into the darkness and the darkness could not overcome it. So these are important themes. And it says that it talks about John the Baptist as testifying to the light, who by implication is Jesus. So in Nicodemus's story here, we have Nicodemus coming by night. So there's some questions we want you to start thinking about. How might you understand the note that Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night in the light of John 3:20? And rack your brains and see if you can think of where else in the gospel these symbols of light and darkness might occur. And why do you think John has chosen them as symbols? Well, how did you go delving into the mind of the author of the Gospel of John?
We didn't really get past the first question.
So what did you come up with then with the first question? How might we understand that Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night? Is John telling us something?
We had a few theories.
Okay, what was that, Sherry?
One theory was that he came at night because he didn't want the other Pharisee to know that he was consorting with Jesus.
Yep.
Another was perhaps maybe coming at night is a reflection of his character. So he's a bit dodgy, didn't want things exposed.
Oh, poor Nicodemus.
He's not really a dodgy character, is he?
No.
He emerges later in
Yeah.
the gospel as one of the advocates for Jesus.
Yeah, but initially I was thinking maybe it's a literary device to kind of set up your expectation of him. And then we had another idea, but I can't remember what it was.
He didn't have the status to have an open meeting with Jesus, we were thinking.
Yeah.
He's a Pharisee, so why would he lack status, do you think? Jesus is the one who's not got status, I would venture to suggest.
And that is why he didn't want to be seen consorting with someone of lesser status than he.
Quite possibly. That's maybe one of the cultural things there. Jesus is the one seen by the Pharisees as being a bit dodgy. So consorting with Jesus might not have helped Nicodemus in his career path.
Might not have been the done thing.
No, that's right. That's quite possible. What about the symbolism with John? I think that Sherry is kind of hinting at that by saying, is he a bit dodgy? If Nicodemus is coming in at night, not thinking of pragmatic reasons why he might do that, like not wanting the other Pharisees to know, what do you think the Gospel of John means by it?
I think he's coming out of ignorance. He's coming from ignorance and he's looking for wisdom or truth.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's a good insight, Patricia.
I wonder also whether whether it actually happened or was John trying to make a point?
John's always trying to make a point. Whether it happened or not, John is still trying to make a point.
That's right.
And maybe can I just ask a question about Nicodemus's name? And I wonder if there's any significance in it. I understand it's a Greek name and it means victory of the people. Is there any significance in that?
Possibly. This is the Gospel of John. There's often significance where you don't expect it.
And John certainly paints characters. He tells the synoptics go, there was a man and he did this and he did that, and John has fairly real people coming out of the page, and so I think that anything that he does is trying to help us to understand who the people are that are involved in the conversation.
Yeah,
as Sherry mentioned, he might have been a bit of a shady character, and as we know later, Nicodemus says, I'll give back the taxes that I've overtaxed. So maybe he was somewhat of a shady character.
Or maybe dark in John would indicate that possibility, or it could indicate someone who's literally what we'd say they're in the dark. That is, they're ignorant. And this is a trope that John uses. So Why do you think John uses light and dark as symbols? Has anyone got any advances on that?
Because it's easiest for people to understand. We can understand if it's light. We can understand if it's dark. We don't even have to know that the sun has come up, therefore it's light, or it's gone down, therefore it's dark. We just know it's light or dark.
Yes, and in the ancient world that was lit by oil lamps and candles, dark is a potent force. It's not like our world where we have artificial lights. And we can't even see the stars properly anymore because of light pollution from our big cities. In the ancient world, that is not an issue. So it's a stark contrast between day and night and light and dark. And it's a good old-fashioned biblical symbol, of course. We find it also in the Old Testament and in Genesis, where God creates the night and the day and light and dark. So it's quite significant in that sense. Anyone else know where in the Gospel symbols of light and darkness occur?
In the story of Lazarus.
There you go, Sue.
In the story of Lazarus, he talks about stumbling at night and not stumbling in the day. So you get that contrast again, and the significance of what we know. We can see where we're going in the light, and people of that time and of this time, as someone else was saying, that's the reality. You can see where you're going in the light.
Just here, it's interesting to reflect that in the dark you go groping around. Now, Geoffrey Blainey wrote a famous book in which he argued that until artificial light was developed, you know, the light globe, people in Australia didn't travel at night. You'd get lost in the bush, you'd fall down a mine shaft, you went walking around in the night. So people stayed at home at night, and it was only with the invention of the light bulb that people started moving abroad.
So the first people travelled around at night because they could actually use the stars, which European people, unless you were a mariner, could not, because it's not something that was taught. It wasn't necessary, having come from gaslit England.
And also the stars here are all wrong for people from the Northern Hemisphere.
They are too, they're quite different. Yep. Yes, they're in different configurations and places. Well, not configurations, but they're in different places.
So Ian's comment then, in broad terms, intensifies the significance of Nicodemus coming by night, because that would be rare to be moving around like that by night. I mean, presumably he had some sort of candle that he could, and he knew his way to where Jesus was or whatever.
Yeah,
or it was moonlit.
Or something.
Well, that's the other thing. Moon helps.
Yes, the moon does help.
Yeah.
One of the things that stays with me from my study of John many decades ago it was now, is that the word in the prologue of John that we often translate as and the light could not overcome it, can also mean and the light could not understand it. Our lecturer said master is actually a better translation because it has both of those things, but of course master then has the other kind
connotation.
It can mean understand as well as overcome. The dark could not overcome the light because it couldn't understand it, perhaps, is what.
Yeah.
And Nicodemus, of course, is coming to look for understanding. I mean, he's genuinely curious. He's not coming here to set a trap for Jesus. He's genuinely curious, and he's coming to ask.
He wants to understand.
He does want to understand. And even though he's come by darkness, we know from what Ian has already said that he develops as a character. And this is one of the tropes of John. He often does the absolute opposite of what you expect is going to happen. So here comes this Pharisee skulking in under cover of darkness, and you think, right, that's going to not end well. And the opposite happens. And we'll see this happen a few times in the Gospel of John as we go through. So we're going to go back
Well,
to
just one other thing that needs to be said. Where else in this gospel is light used?
light and dark, yes.
In chapter 8, which is the chapter where I said there's terrible antagonism between Jesus and the Jewish leaders. It's chapter 8 where Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And then what follows on is the healing of the man born blind in chapter 9. And again, Jesus says during the course of that, I'm the light of the world. So, Nicodemus coming by night to the light leads into those later significant stories.
In
Okay.
that story, John, doesn't he also say night is coming? And so there's sort of a
in chapter 8 or in chapter
sorry.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Paul and Jesus in the synoptics both talk about the night and the thief coming in the night as an apocalyptic image. That's what's immediately in my head, but yeah, maybe.
Catalambano is that word, Judy?
Catalamba, yeah.
Yeah. Does not understand or grasp.
Just coming back to
chapter 9, verse 4, Sue.
Yeah,
You
as
must
long
work
as
the
it's
works of him
day.
who sent me while it's day. Night
We
is
must
coming
do-
when no one can work.
Yeah,
As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world.
and night is coming when no one can work. So that's interesting. It's got a different connotation there, I think.
Yeah.
One thing with the Gospel of John that you'll grasp as we go through this study is John is never to be read in a flat kind of way. John always has 1,000 meanings, more or less. There's layers and layers and layers where he has different symbols and he's drawing on different literary devices, etc., to make his meaning deep and theological and more than just what the words are saying.
So we'll move to another interesting element of the passage.
Yeah, another fun word that scholars spend many times arguing about. We get clues in this passage that Nicodemus doesn't read Jesus very well in what he initially says. And this is a really important theme in this chapter, but it's also going to be an important theme again throughout the Gospel of John. So when Jesus says you must be born from, and the word is anothen in the Greek, Nicodemus sees it as again and as literal. And he actually asks the questions, how can you be born again after having grown old? Can you enter your mother's womb a second time? And this is a common trope in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says something, his hearers take it very literally, and we'll meet it again next week as well. And then Jesus explains, usually in a way that sheds no further light on the topic because it's often very cryptic. Jesus gets the chance then to explain exactly what he means. So there's been a lot of debate over this particular word, anothen. It can mean again, as it does in Galatia, or it can mean from the beginning, as it does in Luke 1. It can also mean from above, as in one who comes from above, like where God is, the heavens. And it can mean anew. So it's not quite again, but to be born anew. And in the description we have in the Gospel of Mark, it can mean from top to bottom. So the curtain in the temple is torn from anothen, top, down to the bottom. So it is the Latin Vulgate that we have to blame for it largely being translated as again, because it was the word that was chosen in that particular biblical version. And subsequently, that's been picked up in the King James Version. And it's entered our language as Christians to talk about being born again. And that is where this comes from. So the author of the Gospel John is doing his thing, and he's used a word that has multiple meanings. Now, you've got to remember that in the story, Nicodemus hears this word. He's not sitting there with his Aramaic or Greek dictionaries and concordances looking up the various meanings of what Jesus might be on about. He's hearing it. So he's hearing a word that can have multiple meanings. And initially he takes it and he misunderstands and he doesn't discern the meaning that's actually intended. So this is, as I said, this is a very common literary bias to.
Well, maybe I'll talk
the Gospel
about
of John.
I'll talk about pneuma
Yes, you can talk
association
about
with this,
that.
because the right-hand side of what you have on the screen, we have the word pneuma appears a number of times in those verses, and pneuma, from which we get pneumatic and pneumothorax and other things to do with breathing, to do with the lungs. Pneuma can be translated as spirit, which it is in verse 5, and it is at the end of verse 8, and it is also in verse 6. But it can also be translated as wind or breath. So in verse 6, what is born of the spirit is spirit. What is born of the breath is breath. That evokes the Genesis creation and also the Ezekiel valley of dry bones. And the translators actually pick that up in verse 8. The wind blows where it chooses and you hear the sound of it, but you don't know where it comes from or where it goes. So it is with everyone who's born of the Spirit. So they've used two English words for the very same Greek word in that one verse. And if you read it by inserting wind instead of spirit, you get a different kind of sense. So our translators are actually making decisions at this point about how that one word is to be understood. So if Nicodemus and Jesus were talking in Greek, which of course is another assumption that probably is not historically accurate, they were probably talking in Aramaic. Jesus is using language again here, not just born from above or anew, but also born from spirit or wind. That invites further reflection by Nicodemus. So
I don't know about Aramaic, but certainly in Hebrew, ruach is the same, it has the same triple meaning. So yes. I imagine that it probably, even whatever language they were talking in, that was that overtone.
Yes, sure.
Well, I think the Aramaic is probably quite similar to the Hebrew anyway, with the ruach. And yes, it's the same in Hebrew. It means breath, wind, or spirit.
Mm.
So having Jesus deliberately speak with words that may invite misunderstanding is a literary technique.
Get used to it. John does it all the time. This is just the beginning.
That's the question for the groups to discuss.
So why is John doing this? Why is he so enamored of this particular idea? So you can have a short discussion in your groups about that. So how did you go with analysing this device of the Gospel of John?
There was so much to unravel, to understand, that I think the enlightenment comes from finally thinking, oh, 2 and 2 does make 4.
Yes, I'm not sure Nicodemus is quite at that point, but he's got a lot to think about.
Yes.
Is it Nicodemus's ignorance? Is this a literary device by the gospel writer to enable Jesus to serve as a cue for Jesus to make a pronouncement about something important?
Yes, and he does it all the time. So yes, it is a literary device that Jesus does. And of course, it also contrasts 2 other things. So Jesus gets to explain what he really means when whoever the poor, unfortunate character is takes him literally. But what is the other contrast we have in Jesus' explanation and the character who took him literally? What other contrast might be contained in that, do you think?
Are you talking about light, dark, or are you talking about from above, from below?
I'm talking about earthly and heavenly.
Yeah, from above, from below.
Below, yes. So from below, earthly, fleshly, as opposed to heavenly, from above, and spiritual.
Yep.
And again, this is commonly found in the Gospel of John. So Nicodemus asks a very fleshly, earthly kind of question. Well, how can I be born again? How can I get back into my mother's womb? And Jesus says, this is about being born of the Spirit. It's being born from above. It's being born of spirit. It's something quite different to what Nicodemus has assumed. So this is again a common contrast. Do you want to add to that, John?
Yeah,
You've stolen my cat.
Yeah, well, he was wanting to get into your room and he was coming in here. He just wants to be part of it, don't you think?
Hello,
Hello, Felix.
Felix.
Yeah, so this from above, from below is quite significant in John's Gospel. Jesus describes him as the one who has come from above. And he says in John's Gospel, I am not of this world. You are of this world, but I am not of this world. So he comes from the heavenly realm, bringing the revelation to those that are caught in the human realm, the material world here below. And that sets up quite a...
And that's the light and the dark, isn't it?
It's light and dark. It's from above, from below, yeah. And when you get to chapter 15 in the discourses, farewell discourses of Jesus, he talks about the world and how the world will hate you. And those that follow Jesus, that have the light, that have been illuminated, that know the truth, are caught in this. They're caught in this world of opposition. There's a whole lot of opposition beyond that's pressing in on them. And I mean, this is picked up in contemporary church life and theology about, you know, beware the wiles of the devil. He's active out there in the world, and hold yourself fast within the community, you know.
It's sort of almost like a jealousy thing, isn't it?
Do you want to unpack that a bit, Patricia?
Well, if you can see that someone is doing well within themselves, I don't mean financially or anything else, but someone who is content and happy and rejoicing in with whatever they've got, I think sometimes people feel envious of that because they can't understand how that person can be like that and I have the same amount, or the same thing, but I'm not happy.
Yeah,
and they're the ones in the dark.
So it's like an analogy that you're offering there. So, you know, if you never are sitting in the light and happy with what you've got, if you're always in the dark, then you're going to be feeling discontent and discombobulated, and you're probably not going to like that person that seems to be at peace and have what you seek but lack.
Yeah, and I think that's a form of jealousy with some people.
Yeah.
You're envying them, their contentment and their joy and their lifestyle, no matter what that lifestyle is.
And it may be that there's something here that those who know Jesus sit in that light and that contentment, if you like, and those outside don't understand it and resent it. Or, yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Why does Jesus seem to revel in these ambiguities? Why doesn't he just say, hey guys, it's what I'm talking about is metanoia. There's got to be a total transformation. Why does he talk in ambiguities and doesn't say it straight and plain so we can all understand?
Well, I think he does in the synoptics to the greater extent. He does in the synoptics. There's a few tricky sayings in there, but not a great deal. Not in the Gospel of John. John has a different way of wanting to put things forward. It's often called the spiritual gospel because it inhabits largely the realm of above as much as it inhabits the realm of below. And Jesus reflects this dichotomy in the Gospel of John. So I'm not sure that the historical Jesus went round with these very ambiguous statements on his lips, but the author of the Gospel of John rather likes the man.
And there is a line of interpretation about the community of which the author of this gospel was a part, and the experiences that they'd had, and the fact that they came to understand that they knew the deeper truth, and those on the outside, those of the world, those still in the dark, didn't know that truth. And so what looks like a plain saying, you must be born again, is actually has a deeper meaning that only the insiders know. There's a famous article written by one of my teachers called The Man from Heaven in Johannine Sectarianism. And he talks about, this is Wayne Meeks, and he talks about how the man from heaven, the one who was from above, who came down to below, brought the truth, spoke the truth, taught the way of salvation to those in this community. And they really became sectarian. And, you know, one of the characteristics of a sect is knowing absolutely assuredly you are right, and therefore everyone else is wrong, and holding people in that sectarian. So it's a bit of a different way of understanding early Christian community, thinking them as a sect. But the way in which that language was used, those on the inside will know, those on the outside will say, what are you talking about? Or else will say, oh, I know what you're talking about, and get it completely wrong. So it reinforces the definition of who we are right.
Are you suggesting that
it sounds like the evangelical church?
Yeah, I mean,
you should say that, Piers.
There is a line that goes into that, Piers. Exactly.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Are you suggesting that the writer of John is a literary smarty pants who is writing for other of his ilk? He's not writing for us, the general membership of the Christian church.
Well,
he's writing for a literary in-group who understand his in-jokes that we don't understand. We need biblical scholars like you to explain it to us. Perhaps his little group of, his literary in-group didn't need that. Is there some sense of that in it?
Probably.
But there's also the fact that most of the people in John's gospel who come to Jesus do it gradually. That understanding develops over time. You have the woman at the well and her conversation going from which eventually leads to the Messiah, and the man born blind who goes from I just know he gave me sight to his whatever it was, I can't remember the exact thing he acclaimed, but there's that kind of stuff too. It's also written for the people who don't see the world in black and white.
Yes. But you've got to realise too, Ian, that most of his literary stuff is Hebraic. That he's using. It's based on things from the Old Testament. And so his community, who are by and large probably Jewish, because we know they've been thrown out of the synagogue, would understand those things. They're used to hearing those things. And a little bit later this morning, we'll get to some of those literary things that he uses. Yes, he's a literary smarty pants. I wouldn't use that word. John is a literary genius. The way he constructs his gospel is magnificent. This guy really does know how to write, and he does the most wonderful things with his symbolism and his multi-layered meanings and his contrasts. It really is a masterpiece.
All right, let's move on to have a bit of a look at Nicodemus beyond this story, because Nicodemus appears 3 times in John's Gospel, as your notes have indicated. Yes. He's there in chapter 3, inquiring of Jesus. He's there in chapter 7, when Nicodemus is before the council, and he speaks up. Does he speak up for Jesus? He certainly speaks up for due process. Our law does not judge people without first giving them a hearing to find out what they are doing, does it? And gets called a Galilean for his troubles. And then the final scene in chapter 19, when he comes with Joseph of Arimathea to take the body of Jesus and anoint it. So we want you to think about what happens to Nicodemus later in this gospel. What do you think he has learned from his encounter with Jesus? What does he take with him that is there in that second encounter in chapter 7 and that third encounter with the body of Jesus in chapter 19? So let's have a pondering about what character development does the author of this gospel offer us in Nicodemus.
Okay, how did you go with Nicodemus? What do you think happened to him along the way?
Well, he
No,
was-
I think he was good. I think he was on a
Yeah.
spiritual journey.
yes.
Yes.
I think he really wanted to know and to understand rather than just accept. He had an inquiring mind, I think.
Yes, he seems to have.
Yes.
And I suspect that the things that Jesus said were linking into some of the questions he had been asking to
Yes.
himself and hadn't dared to ask out loud. As
Yes,
many
I
people
think you're
won't ask
right.
questions in church because they're the wrong questions.
Yes.
Hmm.
So there seems to be a character development, doesn't there, of Nicodemus understanding throughout the Gospel of John.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, John chapter 7, the answer he gets from the Pharisees could confirm that the interpretation is attempting to try and defend Jesus when he says we're supposed to give this person a hearing, because the Pharisees say, well, you must be from Galilee too then. So it
Yes.
doesn't go down well with them. And of course, by the end, and John tells you it's the same Nicodemus. So in chapter 7, he says Nicodemus who'd gone to Jesus before. And in 19, he says Nicodemus, and he reminds you who had first come to Jesus by night. So where is Nicodemus at the moment? Is he day or night?
Day.
He's in the day. They've gone to Pilate to get the body. He's done, and he's curiously, he's doing the women's task. He has bought the myrrh and aloes to anoint Jesus' body, and there's rather a lot of them. As you can see there from the translation, there's an enormous amount of them. And they wrap Jesus' body as, this is a customary thing. It's something you do to honour the dead in linen cloths, according to the burial custom of the Jews. So Nicodemus doesn't appear to be afraid at this point, does he?
No, he's not afraid. I think he's still curious, but I don't think he's afraid.
No, he's not coming at night. He's there in the bright light of day saying to Pilate, give me this body. And he's anointing the body, normally a woman's task. So Nicodemus has moved quite a lot since our meeting with him in chapter 3.
You think maybe Nicodemus was a female anyway?
No.
Thank you.
He was a Pharisee. That would be very hard.
Hey, Patricia, not all good people are females.
A
Fair
Pharisee.
point.
Oh, really?
Just a tick.
Is there something proprietorial in Nicodemus embalming the body? Is he making a statement and saying, look, here I am, I'm one of the leaders of the Jewish people, and by embalming his body, I'm demonstrating that I, for one, accept him for who he claimed to be?
Oh, I think definitely. I mean, Nicodemus is almost parallel with the beloved disciple here. I think we can assume that the fact that Nicodemus goes to Pilate to ask for the body and then takes on the task of anointing tells you that Nicodemus thinks incredibly highly of Jesus and that Nicodemus loves Jesus, and this is the last kind of act he can do for him. So he's right up there at this point in time, I think, with the beloved disciple in terms of how he has come to understand, know, and revere Jesus, if you like.
He's really stuck his neck out, hasn't he?
Yes.
It's an amazingly courageous act.
Yes.
We followed his journey of revelation, in effect.
Sorry, what was that, Sue?
I said we have followed in this his journey of revelation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think that's a really striking offering in John's gospel. It's not just the in community that knows everything and the out community that knows nothing and was always doomed to be out there. Nicodemus has come from that out community at night, has stood up for due process, has taken the body of Jesus, to all intents and purposes, knows now what that inner community knows. So the possibility of knowledge, of moving into that community, of becoming closer to God, that possibility is there. Nicodemus offers that. And I mean, we'll see a similar kind of dynamic next week, but compressed into one chapter with the Samaritan woman.
Yeah.
And we'll see it also with the man born blind, that movement that happens.
The outsider moving to the inside.
Yeah. So it's not just a closed group. It is sectarian, but it's not entirely closed.
It's opening up.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's open to those who understand. Nicodemus takes the whole gospel to finally get there. The Samaritan woman does it somewhat faster. When we look at her next week,
Of course, because
manages it in one encounter.
she's a woman and she gets it quicker.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Man born blind gets it quicker too.
Who does?
The man born blind.
Yes, that's true.
Oh, he does take a little bit. He's not straight there. That's a longer kind of thing.
Well,
But yes, he's faster than Nicodemus.
So from verse 11 of this chapter, Nicodemus seems to fade from view. And at some point in scholarly discussion, maybe Jesus fades from view, and it's the author that's telling us what Jesus was saying or should have been saying. But anyway, Elizabeth's going to talk about literary devices in this section, and she's going to throw more words at you than you've got in your notes.
Yes, so I'm very sorry about that. So
No, you're not. No, you're not.
I am. I apologise in advance for big words. And some of you will know them because we've talked about them before. We've already mentioned dualities such as light and dark, day and night, above and below, flesh and spirit. We've talked about that. And we know, well, you'll find out they're actually quite common in the Gospel of John and very important to understanding the Gospel of John. And there's things like law through Moses, grace and truth through Jesus. So this is all in chapter 1, where the author is setting up all these different kind of contrasting elements or symbols to set the tone for how he's going to develop them in his Gospel. So what is born of flesh is flesh and spirit is spirit, we've seen in chapter 3. John also uses what we call a lot of Hebrew literary devices. And one of the things he's really fond of is what we call parallelisms. Now, parallelisms are phrases put in parallel, like parallel lines. That's how it gets the name. And then it's expressing an idea and then repeating it. You find lots and lots of these things in the Psalms. For example, a psalm might say, the Lord is good, and then it might say, God is great. So that's a parallelism. So it's used two different words for the Lord and God, and it's used two different words to express attributes of God. Now, the Gospel of John knows these kind of Hebraic things, and he uses them quite a bit. So we've got what's called synonymous parallelism. That's expressing one idea, and then you say the same thing, just using different words. Then you have an oppositional parallelism. John's called it antithetical. That means it's in parallel, but it's saying the opposite thing. Like, I am from above, you are from below. You are of this world, I am not of this world. Could be seen as an oppositional or antithetical parallelism. What you've actually cited there, John, in 8:23 is actually a chiastic structure. A chiasm is a fancy parallelism. And it just has an extra, a couple of extra contrasts in it. So, and it's done in the shape of a chiasm. So who knows what I'm talking about when I talk about a chiasm? Anyone? Do you remember? And I'm going to attempt to draw. This is the letter chi in Greek. It looks a bit like an X.
Yep.
And with a chiasm, it has
A, B.
A and B. So, and then it has B and A. So it's like a parallelism. So you are from below, I am from above, you are of this world, and I am not of this world. So it's that's what a chiasm looks like. So it's two ideas sort of in diagonal opposition. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. I'll take it down. It's a bit complicated. You don't really need to know it. But John uses a lot of these things to set up these dualisms. He's using Hebrew literary structure to highlight them and explain what the difference are. So we've got a passage there below for you to have a look at, and we'll have a look at it now and see if you can spot in it different things. Can anyone see a parallelism, for instance?
Well, there's the speak of what we know and
Ascended from heaven and descended, who descended from heaven.
yeah, and lifted and lifted.
Lifted and lifted. So we've got Moses
14.
lifted up the serpent, the Son of Man must be lifted. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. It's what we know and earthly things that you do not believe.
And then we've got, can anyone see an oppositional parallelism? I think you just talked about one there, Enid.
Yeah, verse 12, earthly things.
Verse 12.
Yeah.
If you don't, if I told you about earthly things and you don't believe, how can you believe about heavenly things? So they're things set in opposition to each other.
Right.
And the ascended and descended.
That's right. Ascending and descending.
Lifted and lifted.
Yep.
Those who believe in him are not condemned, but those who do not believe are condemned.
Yes, that's another oppositional parallelism there. And there's one right before it. The Son of Man did not send, the God did not send the Son into the world to condemn, but in order the world might be saved through him.
Yep.
So this little excerpt John's given you here, it's a set of parallelisms from beginning to end, really.
Surprisingly.
Surprisingly, this is John. This is what John does. So when I said that John has actually constructed a literary masterpiece, I was deadly serious. Using the literary techniques of his culture and his tradition, he's constructed a gospel in a very deliberate, and it's quite beautiful way, because this is quite poetic when you see it set out in the Greek, where he's got all these, you know, things agreeing with each other and things set in opposition to each other. So heaven and earth, or, you know, created and made, or flesh and spirit, or there's all sorts of things there, lifting up, and then loved and condemned. And you've got all these things together. And this is how the author of the Gospel of John writes. And this brings out his deeper meanings that he wants people who are hearing or reading this gospel to understand.
Elizabeth, well, regardless of the literary devices, the parallelism and the dualisms, in that verse 16, you know, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that's one of the great statements of our faith, isn't it? It's right at the centre of our faith. And people have written hymns about it. We were taught about it in Sunday school. It's right there at the centre of our faith. It's what we believe. And we actually don't need the literary devices to believe it.
Well, we maybe not, but that's because we're 2,000 years on from where John was. So that's part of it. And this is probably one of the most quoted verses in Christian tradition that you will find, John 3:16. It is quite central, as you said. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we've got this gospel that includes that, that's beautifully constructed to actually highlight that.
And I guess, Elizabeth, just hearing Ian's point, it's remind me how important, you know, Nicodemus, he came with a curious mind. I think what I learned from today, it's important for us to don't take for granted what we believe, you know.
No, and also don't, and to if people come to us with an inquiring mind or a question, to listen.
Yeah.
And talk to them and not say, well, you don't get it, so, you know, there's the door. That's not what it should be about, because people do go on journeys. Nicodemus might have taken him a few years here, but he got there in the end. And that's what's important.
And I think that's the same for all of us. We get there in the end.
Yeah.
It's not the beginning that counts, it's the journey towards the end. And it's the end that counts.
And it is a journey through the Gospel of John. And it is set up in such a way that along the journey, there's all these signposts and there's all these ways that you can understand and achieve better understanding. So it's not just taking a verse and saying, right, that's it, and the rest of it's irrelevant. It's looking at that verse and saying, well, it's central to this gospel. And we're actually going to unpack how it's central and why it's central and how people actually develop as a result of it.
Yes,
And
it's
it's a
the
gospel.
development that's important.
Yeah,
It's a gospel for people who don't naturally just think in black and white terms, for people who
Yes.
ask questions and need to
They
have
need
the
to
questions
know.
answered, rather than, I remember singing faith is just believing what God says is true, but for me it's never been quite like that.
yeah. I mean, John's gospel is a wonderful gospel on many levels. It's probably the most clever literary gospel that we have. It may be the most clever literary book that we have in the New Testament. And it's quite wonderful in the way that it's been written and developed. And it is providing entry points all through it where people who are inquiring can actually engage with it and look at what that might mean.
Mm.
So Elizabeth, I have forgotten why wasn't John included in the Synoptic Gospels?
Because he's too different. He's got very little in common with them. He shares the passion narrative and the overturning of the temple, and I think 1 or 2 miracles, and that's it. The rest of it's actually very, very different.
Well, I mean, John was included in the canon. That was a decision of the church over the centuries. The designation Synoptic Gospel and John as the fourth and different gospel, that's a contemporary critical construction, a title that's developed by later interpreters. So
the fathers
church
knew John was different.
Yeah, they knew he was different.
They all knew he was different.
But the church from early on had included John alongside of the others, recognizing that there were different points of view. So that in itself says that early Christianity wasn't monolithic and single focused, that it had room for diversity.
Yeah. So Rosemary's question's asking why isn't John a synoptic gospel? John can't be part of that. It's just too different. There are very, very few points of connection between John and the synoptics.
So a synopsis is getting different pieces of text and lining them up side by side and seeing where the things are similar and different. And the Matthew, Mark and Luke have lots of bits where you can see sometimes almost verbatim wording and certainly similar things, but the same stories. And John doesn't.
No, he doesn't. He just doesn't. It's very different. And the style is very different. I mean, this kind of literary construction that John has in his gospel is just not in the synoptics. Who are writing largely a narrative. This is a great poetic kind of midrash that John has produced here. And so the style is different, the content is different, the events are different, the people are different. There's some similarities, but not, there's a lot of dissimilarities as well. And sometimes John takes something that the synoptics have got and reworks it in quite a different way. So that's why he's not a synoptic gospel. He's got his own thing going here.
And Elizabeth, the last few minutes of our conversation, what you and John said, remind me of Dean Drayton's book, Which Gospel? I think it's important for us as Christians to listen in and see which gospel that this person is talking about.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, John probably fits closer to the Pauline corpus, I would say, than he does to the synoptics in the conclusions that he comes to. And that's why you will find in evangelical churches the Gospel of John and Paul is read far more frequently than Matthew, Mark and Luke. And as for that that letter, that's, what did he call it? An epistle of straw, Luther said. It barely gets a mention, and that would be the letter of James. So thematically, it sits more with the Pauline stuff than it does with the synoptics.
Elizabeth, I had a question from last week after it had time to percolate.
Yep.
About, my husband laughed when I said that too. The connection between Lady Wisdom and Jesus. Sally Douglas has a book coming out, Jesus Sophia.
Yep.
And that's a new concept to me. Can you explain a little bit about how the connection between that feminine idea of Jesus, the person of Jesus, and the wisdom bit. I don't quite get it.
Wisdom in the Old Testament is talked about being present at the beginning of creation, and that things were created with wisdom there. Maybe not through her, but she's part of that process. And with the Gospel of John, he starts by setting up the fact that Logos, or Jesus, was there in the beginning, and all things were created through Jesus. So you've got a direct parallel between wisdom in Proverbs and Jesus in the Gospel of John. Okay. They're doing the same thing, essentially. So Jesus has taken on the role that was ascribed to wisdom in the Old Testament.
Okay.
Essentially, in the Gospel of John. Then we have Colossians, where you've got this hymn about Jesus was there at the beginning and he was all things and all things created through him there, similar to the Gospel of John. You'll find that's based on the attributes of wisdom from, again, from Proverbs, particularly chapter 8, but I also think chapter 9 and 11. You'll find those attributes of wisdom that are described in Proverbs are all present in Colossians, but they're describing Jesus.
Yeah, okay.
Is this a coincidence? No.
I wondered if it had to do with the word logos.
Well, logos is just word. So in the beginning there was the word. So
is that to do with, like, because we get like knowledge and it's got all those connotations of study and.
Well, so in the beginning, you've got God creating with his word in Genesis. In the beginning, you've got wisdom present at creation, doing stuff. And then you've got Jesus saying he was at creation and he was actually the word spoken by God, and he's doing the same stuff as wisdom is said to be doing. So that's what the link is. And yes, it's deliberate.
Yep, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Should we go to the final set of questions?
Yes.
We wanted to give people an opportunity just to look back at Nicodemus and his development, his learning journey, and think a little bit about your own situation. So where do you think your journey of learning is taking you or might take you? Thinking about the risks for Nicodemus in the story, both in what he did in chapter 3 and again in chapter 7 and again in chapter 9. Each of them were risky actions. We might like to think about what are the things that distract us from learning God's word and carrying out God's work in the world, and where is our journey of learning taking us?
Any final comments anyone has that they'd like to share? You're not under any obligation to do so.
We didn't discuss this in our group. One thing I like about the Uniting Church is that statement in the basis of union, we are a pilgrim people. We're on a journey to a place we haven't got to yet. And unlike some other churches, at this stage, we don't have all the answers. We're searching for them. And that notion that somebody mentioned earlier in this discussion of a search, a pilgrimage, that's important for me. Saying it another way, it's lifelong learning. You never know it all. Through sessions like this, you learn a little bit more. Your knowledge and experience advances incrementally, but you remain on a pilgrimage to seek more.
Yes, I think that's a really good way of summing it up, Ian. And like Nicodemus, we're always finding something that we can learn along the journey. And the Uniting Church recognises that it is always a journey. We never quite arrive at the promised land at this point in time, but we learn along the way.
And I think that you and John have just provided the road and a bit of the map where we can explore that journey that we're on.
Well, that's very kind of you, Margot. We try and do something that helps people to understand their Bible and and their tradition, and, you know, something of the culture of Jesus and an better understanding of that. Yeah, so we do try and do that. So thank you for that. And thanks to Judy, because I know John is one of Judy's things. Judy has a PhD actually in the Gospel of Thomas, which is closely aligned with John in a number of ways. So thank you for your contributions this morning, Judy.
I actually have a chapter in a book that's called Eyewitness Testimony, and my chapter is Eyewitness Testimony in the characters of the fourth gospel, which looks at some of those issues like, are they Jesus' exact words? How can we find Jesus through the thing? I would be quite happy to share that. It's an academic thing, but I don't think it uses inaccessible language. It's just got lots of footnotes. So if I could send that to John and he could distribute it if people are interested.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And if you're find it's heavy going, you can just delete it. Good people, don't feel obliged to read it.
Because it was written for a somewhat different audience. So
yes, but yes, people may find things in it that they find helpful or useful, especially you, Ian. I think it might be of interest to you, given some of your questions. So thank you for that offer, Judy. And if you do that, John will send it out.
So before you conclude, during our talks, Otto started a phrase, growing in faith. What does it mean? Well,
Otto, do you want to answer that, seeing you said it? What does growing in faith mean for you?
Oh, Kuma. Growing in faith.
It's something we talk about, growing in faith.
Oh, it got me there, Kuma. I lost
I think that one can always grow in faith, because as one learns, one's faith will evolve. Kumar, as a child, your faith might have been quite simple, like, you know, Jesus came to earth, I believe in God and God loves me. As you get older, that will become more complex.
Yeah.
And you will learn more, and you will maybe understand better how your relationship with God and your experience is kind of testifying or not testifying to that relationship with God and what you believe. So I would see it as faith evolves. It's like theology evolves. There's always more to learn. And as you learn more, your faith will grow or deepen, or it might fall away, but it's a journey.
Yeah. Sorry, Kuma. Yeah, sorry, Kuma. Just like Nicodemus, you know, learning never stop. And here we have an example of a growing faith. Nicodemus. I think that's all I can say at this point, Kumar. What's what you're looking for?
Is that helpful, Kumar?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.